Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking an impartial look at a really intense political debate unfolding right now in Australia over investor tax hikes. If you've been glued to the news, you know the rhetoric is red hot. But to really get what's going on, we've got to separate the opposition's fierce political pushback from the actual concrete policy proposals they're bringing to the table. So let's map out exactly what's being argued step by step, drawing directly from the Shadow Treasurer's own words.
All right, let's dive right in. We're starting out of the gate with a pretty striking claim from Shadow Treasurer Tim Wilson, who flat out describes the current government's budget as a complete train wreck. Now, this quote instantly captures the opposition's highly critical perspective on the government's financial management. It really sets the stage for their broader narrative, that the government is totally mishandling the economy, which creates the foundation for the opposition to not just criticize, but eventually pitch their very own alternative framework.
But you might be wondering, what exactly triggered this latest round of intense pushback? Well, the catalyst is the Labor government's legislative strategy. Basically, they're making a move to fast-track some highly controversial changes to investor taxes right before Parliament hits its midwinter break. And, crucially, they're looking to pull this maneuver off with likely support from the Greens. So this incredibly tight timeline, that is the immediate battleground we're looking at today.
Part 1. The political rhetoric.
So to really understand the strategy at play here, we need to break down the opposition's specific critiques regarding how this legislation is being handled. These points represent the absolute core of the Shadow Treasurer's argument. Wilson claims that rushing this legislation is, at its heart, an act of damage limitation. He argues the government is deliberately trying to ram these tax changes through quickly, just to stop everyday Australians and small business owners from having the time to organize and speak out against the consequences. He actually goes so far as to accuse the Prime Minister of showing contempt for self-starters, basically suggesting this fast-tracking is a total betrayal of public trust. On top of that, he criticizes their reliance on what he calls tricky deals with the Teals and Greens, arguing that these deals empower politicians rather than actually empowering the Australian public. But, as we know, in Parliament, numbers are the name of the game. Wilson openly acknowledges that the opposition just doesn't have the parliamentary numbers right now to physically block the bill on the floor. So what do? Well, they pivot. They're directing all that public frustration to a dedicated website to gather real-world stories of how the budget and these specific tax changes are going to impact the livelihoods of everyday Australians. It's essentially a strategy of taking a legislative defeat and channeling it right into a grassroots pressure campaign.
Now, during the debate surrounding these tax hikes, a really interesting hypothetical was raised. What if the government creates special exemptions, carve-outs, specifically for startups before the legislation even hits Parliament? This was floated as a possibility. And let me tell you, it prompted a very specific and highly contrasting reaction from the Shadow Treasurer about who the government is actually listening to.
Wilson frames this potential startup carve-out with a really stark contrast. He argues that if the government protects startups but leaves traditional small businesses out in the cold, it proves they're just catering to well-connected tech bros and massive political donors. He compares this directly to the everyday self-starters. We're talking about the corner milk bars, the folks who've saved, sacrificed, and worked those brutal nights and weekends just to get ahead. He claims the government is completely disinterested in these traditional, everyday workers and is opting instead to just listen to the loudest, most connected voices in the room.
Part 2. The policy pitch.
Okay. Pivoting away from the political critique and looking at their concrete proposals, the opposition has launched a brand new campaign called Stand with Small. Their ultimate goal here? To force a massive shift in the national economic focus and put small businesses firmly back at the very heart of the country's economic policy. But hey, a campaign website isn't a policy, right? The actual cornerstone of this whole push is the proposal of a brand new piece of legislation, the Small Business Act. The opposition is currently in the consultation phase for this act right now. Its defined purpose is to literally codify specific economic rights for small businesses that they just don't have today. The overarching idea here is to legally mandate that the government absolutely must advocate for, engage with, and fight for small enterprises, shifting away from this ad hoc treatment to permanent, rock-solid legal standing.
So what exact rights are we actually talking about here? Well, Wilson outlines three massive shifts. First, a guaranteed right to be heard in major economic institutions like the Reserve Bank. These are places where big unions currently hold a lot of sway, but small businesses are pretty much locked out. Second, the right to fully and fairly bid on lucrative government programs. And third, and this is perhaps the most significant piece of the whole shebang, mandatory impact statements for new laws.
That third point is absolutely vital to their pitch. As Wilson puts it, we want to understand when law goes through Parliament that small business has a say in understanding the impact of it.
Basically, the opposition is demanding that before any new law passes, and they even explicitly mention policies from the Reserve Bank, the exact economic fallout on small businesses must be thoroughly assessed and clearly understood. They argue that the current government is completely disinterested in how their inability to manage the budget literally takes wealth away from these hardworking business owners.
Now, to defend the feasibility of this massive new requirement, Wilson draws a really specific comparison. He points out that the Parliament already utilizes impact statements for other areas of regulation, most notably human rights. So his argument is actually pretty simple. If the legislative process can accommodate deep, complex impact assessments for human rights, well, it's equally necessary to implement a similar standard to protect the economic health of small businesses.
And that brings us to the ultimate question. We've got the government fast-tracking controversial tax changes, and on the other side, the opposition demanding a sweeping new Small Business Act. But when the political theater finally settles, what are the real-world consequences going to be for the everyday self-starters caught right in the crossfire of this debate? Will these maneuvers actually protect their livelihoods or just stifle their ability to get ahead? That is the absolutely critical question you should take away from this explainer today. Thanks so much for joining me, and definitely keep that question in mind as this intense debate continues to unfold.